Hi everyone, this is Karol AR from Mexico. I was wondering if you're able to hear me. We're broadcasting live from Mexico City at the moment, and we're going to be discussing issues on SCG 14. My name is, yes, I see some people over here, and just let me know if you're able to hear me so we can start. Okay. Give it a couple seconds to start our discussion. Okay. Yeah, it's so good. Okay, it's working out. Um, so, my name is Karol AR. I'm very, very happy to have been invited by the SCG Action Campaign to join you in a little bit of a discussion on SCG 14 on life below water. At the moment, I'm in Mexico City, which is an interesting place to be at the moment because we just had a natural disaster, an earthquake that happened a few days back, and so far we're still recovering from the process. This has been quite an interesting as well as shocking experience to be here. And it also makes you think about what is going on with the SCGs, what are governments going to do? Are they enough resilient to what might happen? It's not only the case with earthquakes, we also had hurricanes in the last couple of weeks hitting the coast of Mexico. So it's a very interesting and perhaps some call it dangerous place to be at the moment. So hopefully nothing will happen again, because it has been, like I said, a very painful and shocking experience for us. But there are other things to celebrate for today. Today is a very, very important day, something that's very deep in my heart, which is the celebration of the SDGs. I can't believe it has been 2 years since we adopted the SDGs at the UN General Assembly. 2 years ago, I was at the UN headquarters in New York, joining hundreds of young people, hundreds of world leaders, and very various sectors in adopting what is now the 2030 agenda, which we hope it's going to be achieved by 2030. So it has been quite an interesting journey for me to be involved in the SDGs, I have to say. I have adopted many SDGs throughout the process. I have not only been involved in the adoption and the definition of the SDGs, but also leading different efforts across the country to implement the SDGs, to educate people about the SDGs, but also to influence public policy. And this year particularly, I became very, very touched by SDG 14 because of the importance it has, yet it's not at the top of the list, or it's not at the priorities that people are setting to be achieved by 2030, even though we have a big problem with what's going on with the oceans. Mexico, in the case of my country, for example, we have around 2 million kilometers of wait, let me see if I'm getting that right, because I get confused with Spanish and English. But our country has a surface of over 2 million square kilometers, and over 6,000 species live in this water surface. And this is very, very important because out of the 32 states, 17 live live at the coast. So it's very important for us. We have two oceans that kind of like surround Mexico. In difference to other countries, Mexico has a very, very important industry of related to what we do with fishing, related to what is going on with the oceans. And of course, it's an income for us because it also has to do with tourism. So we get a lot of tourists coming from different parts of the world to enjoy the beautiful Mexican beaches, from Baja California, which is on the East Coast, all the way to Cancun, Playa del Carmen, and many other widely known places in Mexico that are very important for us. So as for the SDGs, I do have to say that if you're familiarized or not with the story behind the SDGs, I think it's important to know that the topic of the oceans, what we're discussing with what's happening with life below water is very important, because when the MDGs, the Millennium Development Goals, were adopted in the year 2000, they talked about different priorities such as health, especially maternal health, or combating certain transmittable diseases, especially in continents like Africa or in some places in Latin America. So they talked a lot about health, but also about things related to eradicating poverty or to having access to sanitary conditions, et cetera, et cetera. They didn't take into account many other issues that back then were not as bad as they are now. And those are related to climate change and the impacts of human activity upon nature. And that, of course, includes the oceans, and of course includes forests and many other issues that were not very evident then. They're as they are now. Even if you look at the news at the moment, we just had like 5 or 4 different hurricanes hitting the Caribbean, affecting our country, but affecting others, such as the Dominican Republic, and of course Puerto Rico. And it's right at the news at the moment, and what happened in Houston as well. So the MDGs did have a discussion on the environment, but it's not the MDGs as the SDGs have it. And the reason that the SDGs did include the discussion is because it was an open consultation. It included a lot of both online and offline activities, especially providing people with different tools for them to participate and be involved in the process. So the difference between the MDGs and the SDGs, and why we then had 8 goals to why we now have 17 goals, it has to do with that, with the discussion. And one of the things that helped a lot and contributed a lot to what was going on with those discussions was the My World Survey. The My World Survey was an instrument facilitated by the then UN Millennium Development, the UN Millennium Campaign, of the UN, which turned into the UN SDG Action Campaign that you know now. And the campaign facilitated this instrument that asked easy questions about what people wanted to see reflected in the SDGs. So, of course, a lot of people brought up the issue of fly below water. For example, in my state, in Jalisco, Mexico, where I was involved in facilitating 400,000 ballots, as well as in other parts of the country, people did take into account what was going on, especially with rivers and with lakes and pollution and people getting cancer for what was being consumed from the oceans, et cetera, et cetera. So that is the reason why this is in the discussion, and it's at the top of, or at least in one of the 17 goals at the moment. And just in the case of my country, for example, last year between May and June, we had the opportunity to facilitate the new My World Survey. If you haven't had the chance to answer the survey, you will see a link in the description of this live video. And what we ask is for people to tell us if they know about the SDGs and what are their top priorities within the 2030 agenda. And in the case of Mexico, this was really interesting. And this is actually open data that you can look at, data.myworld2030.org. Mexicans position SDG 14 right at the bottom. So we still need to interpret a lot of things that have to do with that, but we see that at least in the case of Mexico, even though we have 2 oceans that surround our country, even though we have 6,000 kinds of different species that depend on what's going on in the oceans, people do not relate or do not see life below water as something that's urgent, as something that needs our attention, or it's something that our government should be working on. And this is quite interesting because, like I mentioned before, many diseases come from that, such as cancer or another transmittable diseases. So, and of course, it has impacts on climate change, and of course, there's pollution that lead to many other things, not only health, but also other animals that consume fish or things that happen in the ocean. So for us, it was very, very interesting to see that people were not at all into positioning SDG 14 as a development priority. So the next question was why? I mean, everyone wants to see poverty eradicated. Everyone wants to have access to health services. Everyone wants a decent job. Everyone wants a tourist communities and cities, but it seems that none of the people that we were serving wanted to see public policies being focused on what was going on in the oceans, even though for us it's a source of income, as like I mentioned, because of tourism. So we saw that there was an interest in comparison to what happened with the MDGs and this transition of environmental issues. Let us not forget that the SDGs have a component of environmental impacts. In this case, we have the SDG 15 on life on land, we have climate action, and now we have life below water and other interrelated SDGs. But this was important for us to see that now people wanted to see the discussion taking on the public policy. So this year in June, June 5th to 9, there was the first ever ocean conference taking place at the UN headquarters. And it was very interesting to see that the UN General Assembly launched a platform for people who are working in the field, who are working in different communities, who are working in the coast to join and establish a national voluntary commitment. So we did that. We did that with a group of volunteers, taking into account the data. In this case, the data that was being facilitated by the My World Survey. I mean, if the SDG was at the very, very bottom of the list, what we would do now is to try to understand what this was going on. So we signed a national voluntary commitment with the help of at least 100 volunteers and 60 organizations from across sectors, just to see how people will react to the discussion of the SDGs, especially SDG 14. And this led to different interests from people to start beach cleanups, to create awareness activities, recycling, telling people that, for example, in the world, year by year, we produce around 300 million bottled waters, at least 8 million of those end up in the ocean. And we have many examples of those things happening in a country. So we also took the discussion into interesting data, such as looking at the fact that the average American citizen might consume up to 315 bottles per person of plastic every year, and that will end up in the ocean. So it also not only had to do with what governments would do, but also how would citizens react to changing the way that we consume, to changing patterns, to changing the way that we see things, because we see, especially if you not live on the coast, you see this as something that's isolated and that's not of your business or your problem. So so that's exactly what we do with the national voluntary commitment that the UN General Assembly facilitated this year. So far, the volunteers have been working on Mexico, have been able to achieve great things, for example. And there's an interesting people, especially with children, because I'll give you an example of something that we did in the state of Veracruz, which is at the east coast of Mexico. It's actually 4 hours away from Mexico City. We gathered a group of children from a school called CESUVER, Colegio de Estudios Superiores de Veracruz. And what we did with them is for them to voluntarily participate in beach cleanups. So we took around 35 children to participate in this activity. And it was very, very interesting because the kids were already kind of like familiar as what was going on, and they had a purpose to go and do the beach cleanups. But then small businesses that surrounded the beaches started asking when the kids would come back and clean the beaches and kind of like pick up the trash. So that was very, very hurtful for us because we're doing all this, all this creating awareness, all this training for children to join and look at what's going on in the oceans, especially because those children live in the coast. They live in the port of Veracruz, but adults were reacting in a very, very interesting way, which is they were not helping the children out. They were expecting for the children to do other things. So this, of course, has to do with changing the way we look at the problem, with educating our people, especially starting at the very young age. So this pattern does not repeat itself. So that's just one example. We have another example that just happened last week in which we had a group of young people. It's interesting to see that many young people participate in these processes. We had a young people mobilizing 9 tons of trash removal in the state of Baja California, which is in the total opposite part of the country, which is on the West Coast, and they were able to do that. And it was very, very interesting for them to do that exercise. This is actually the first time in almost 2 years of hard work as a network of volunteers that we've been able to collect as much trash. But then what's kind of like striking and very shocking for us is that we sometimes go back a week after or 2 weeks after, and the problem is there again. So we need to look at the way we're educating people in terms of what's going on in the ocean. And even though that if we live in cities, how we consume in the cities eventually has an impact on what's going on in the coast. Among the things that we do is to ask people for simple things, just like stop using straws when you go to a restaurant. Stop buying plastic cups. My mom always used to tell me that when she was young and she would get a soda or she would get milk, she would have glass bottles that she would take back, and then she would get a new one but then take it back. So this is actually related to SDG 12 as well, which is the way that we consume and the way that we're looking at the problem and how we can solve it. And that is in terms of what you can do as a citizen and what we have kind of done as a team as well. And so far we have, since March, that the Ocean Conference launched a platform for national voluntary commitments, we've been able to achieve over 100 awareness activities, as well as 35 beach cleanups in at least 6 states, which is a lot considering this is all voluntary work. In terms of how you can influence your politicians, because I think that at the end of the day, even though if you don't live in the coast, but you still have a lake or have a river close by, and this is a source of not only income, but this is also related to your health. I think the way that we collect data, and this is why the My World Survey is very helpful, along with other instruments to measure how our SDGs are doing. We need to make our governments accountable about what's going on. And one of the first things that we do is to take this to our presidency, to the body in charge of following up with the SDGs, and asking them a simple question: who is following up with this SDG? Who is following, what entities in the government are following up with this target? What are the indicators that my government is committed to? These are valid questions that you should ask your governments, and especially the local governments, because having worked with the SDGs for a couple years now, I've realized that even though you can make a lot of efforts as civil society, you can gather with other young people, you can do a lot of things with schools or other stakeholders, even the private sector, which in the case of us, it has happened. Nothing will matter if we don't make our governments at the very local level accountable for this and ask them valid questions about how they're implementing the SDGs at the very local level. Because the local level, at the end of the day, is your immediate reality, is your everyday, is how we live our lives. So we asked those questions first to the presidency, and in the case of several different states that are working with us, we asked them to also put those questions on the table for very local entities. So I think that's something that all of us should do as people who are involved in the SDGs, especially because, like I said, in the case of my country, which I hope that you replicate in yours, is first look at the data. Something very simple, a very, very simple survey that at least tell you how people are prioritizing the SDGs. And it's not the same what happens in cities, it's not the same development priorities that take place in the cities, that take place in the coast, or small towns, or any other places. So the first thing that I would advise people to do if you're championing an SDG, particularly this one, is to look at the data, is to produce data, is to, if you're gonna ask valid questions, you also have to have a very, very solid background in terms of what I want to achieve. So I don't know if you guys have any questions. I was told that I had to do this for around 10 or more minutes. This is the experience that we have so far with SDG 14. I kind of like I said, I adopted this SDG because I look at the data, and not only the data, but the problems that came behind the data, going to the field, participating in beach cleanups, having the opportunity to be with people who might have lost their source of income, who are now sick because of what's going on in the oceans, because now you get plastic instead of fishes. So ask the valid questions to the community as well. Tell them how you can help. I think that what I've found interesting about the SDGs is that everyone plays a role, no matter how small or big. Everyone has something to contribute, even though if it's your skills, your experience, your creativity, your technology, whatever it is that can contribute to the SDGs, is something that we should all definitely do. Because let's take into account that this might be a government commitment. This might be an international, intergovernmental commitment that 193 countries made exactly 2 years ago. But at the end of the day, it needs the help of everyone to be able to be achieved by 2030. And some of the things that the SDGs have, particularly in terms of environmental aspects, is that we must achieve them even earlier than 2030. And having just suffered from a natural disaster, some of the people from our team in the coast, and here with an earthquake, which was very, very scary, I can tell you was a very painful, and still being a very painful experience, is that we definitely need to take action and try to change on our consumption patterns, the way we look at things, the way we communicate things, and how we get people involved. So I really enjoyed talking to you guys about this. Let me see if you have any questions. There are many different initiatives that you can do. There are many examples. I suggest you look at NGOs such as Plastic Oceans, or hashtag Clean Seas, or even looking at what the UN General Assembly is doing with a national voluntary commitment. Gather a couple of friends, even though if you don't live in a coast, if you're not very familiar as to what's going on with the oceans, the least you can do is to change consumption patterns in what's going on in cities or very remote rural areas. So if you guys don't have any questions, I really, really enjoy talking to you. I hope that you can still contribute to what needs to be achieved by 2030 or earlier, like I said, and I look forward to be continue to have these discussions with people. Let's see if we have. Oh, thank you, Azucena, and thank you all the others who joined this conversation. I send you a big hug from Mexico. Please keep looking at the news. Keep yourself engaged in this, and good luck and happy anniversary to the SDGs.